we're spending days and days talking about it, it's probably a good idea to spend some time trying to define happiness. Are there different types of it? Excitement, satisfaction in a job well done, ecstasy, settle down, being immersed in some activity, peaceful nothingness, waking up and realising it's a public holiday, making friends with a chimpanzee. And does what people consider happiness to be differ across cultures? Well, our next speaker has researched happiness in, amongst other places, Greenland, Israel, India, Kenya. He's worked with the Amish, he's worked with the Maasai, and he's written extensively on happiness and empathy. He's written Happiness Unlocking the Mysteries of Psychological Wealth. He's the Program Director at the Centre of Applied Positive Psychology, Portland State University in the USA, and he is Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener. Please make him very welcome.
Good morning. Mahatma Gandhi famously criticized the West in a number of different ways. He thought there were some problems with Western society, including our use of technology, our use of commerce, and even our use of science. He famously said that science without humanity is not a science. And so what I want to offer you today, to my poor, modest ability to do so, is both a little bit of science and a little bit of humanity, so that we don't get one heaping without the other. I think they serve up a nice dish when the ingredients are combined. As you just heard in the introduction, I have a pretty cool job on paper. I travel the world and study happiness. It sounds good, makes for good conversation. I like it at dinner parties when people say, "What do you do?" because I have something cool to say. I've had the fantastic opportunity to work with extraordinary cultures all around the world. For example, the Maasai in Kenya. I've spent months living with them, speaking with them, walking through the bush with them, taking meals with them, occasionally getting sick after those meals with them. And they have taught me some pretty interesting things. One of the interesting things I learned from the Maasai is that when you live relatively close to the bone, materially speaking, it's easy to set standards that everyone can meet. So just take, for example, beauty standards. How good looking do we think an individual is? It may seem like a superficial idea, how good looking you are, but it's important in some ways. In modern, economically developed societies, there's all sorts of things we can do to enhance our physical appearance. Things like jewelry. And there's a huge range of standards between a very cheap watch and the most expensive watch you could possibly buy, for example. Among the Maasai, however, there's a relatively constricted range. Certainly there's nicer quality beadwork and there's poorer quality beadwork, but basically everybody has access to beadwork. And the difference between the best and the worst piece of beadwork is not all that great, although it does make a difference internally within their culture. But because they have standards that are so easy to meet, it helps people raise their collective sense of themselves, of their evaluation of life. And so when I went to Kenya and I asked these people, "How satisfied are you with yourselves?" their answers topped the chart. They didn't say, I'm thinking about checking into rehab, I'm going on a retreat to find myself, I've got a weekend seminar coming up. These are people who have a very firm sense of themselves. They like themselves. They think they're good people. I've had the extraordinary opportunity to go to Qaanaaq and Siarpaluk at the very northern tip of Greenland. Siarpaluk is the northernmost town in the world. If you continue walking north, You just eventually end up heading south. You walk right over the North Pole. And here, where people again live because of their harsh environment in a way that lacks many of the material luxuries that we enjoy in North America and Australia and Europe and other places. They live in very simple houses. They largely substitute any kind of economic earnings they have with hunting. It's one of the last Inuit communities that's still engaged in very traditional methods of hunting. Instead of speedboats, they use kayaks. Instead of shotguns or other more modern hunting devices, they use harpoons. They use dog sleds. They're still very much anchored in their traditional way of living where hunting is concerned. So I was particularly interested in going out with them while they were engaged in these traditional activities. While 5 or 6 of them went up to a fjord and pitched camp and caught salmon out of the river. I was interested in their flow experiences, in catching them at the shiniest moments of their life. And even here in the barren reaches of Greenland, I found happiness. I've lived with the Amish in the American Midwest. I've lived with Old Order and New Order Amish communities. I've stayed in their homes. I've eaten lunch with them. I've eaten dinner with them, which they call supper, which confuses me. I learned some interesting things from the Amish. The Amish have such a tremendous sense of community. Because they have such a closed genetic pool, if you will, they don't marry too many non-Amish people, and their communities are quite small, you find relatively high rates of various cancers, bipolar illness, and some other health problems within their communities. Now, the Amish have no real medicine of their own. I mean, they have folk remedies and some folk cures, but they rely entirely on the North American modern medical system. So when they get cancer, they don't have an Amish cure for it. They just go to the hospital, the modern hospital. But when an Amish person gets cancer, the entire community pitches in for their treatment. And I never in my life have pitched in for the cancer treatment of someone I've known. So I think that's quite remarkable that they have this tremendously intact sense of community, enviable, in fact. On the other hand, the Amish have a cultural trait, because they are a fundamentalist religious sect, that they actively avoid anything that would seem to be godly. That is, they suppress anything that would hint of pride. It sounds quite nice, right? They're essentially humble. But they also actively suppress things that they might naturally see as a job well done. Any type of success they have, they are anxious to deflect away from themselves. And it merely raises a question for me: do they cost themselves some amount of happiness? Is there an optimal amount of humility? Do they take it to an extreme? I don't know, certainly. I'm far more interested in asking such questions than getting the answers, in fact. But one of the questions that has most plagued me, most burned me, is the question of the extraordinarily poor in places like Kolkata, India. About 15 years ago, I went to Kolkata for the first time because I wanted to know. I wanted to know, for people who live in absolutely dire poverty, how are they doing? Are they happy despite their poverty? Are they unhappy? Is their poverty making them miserable? I'm an objectivist. I'm a scientist. I don't want to presume to know. I could make an argument either way right now that would sound completely logical and completely rational. My hunch is that everyone in this room harbors an opinion about the matter. But the one group that had not yet been consulted on the matter was the people actually living in Kolkata. And I thought it seemed reasonable to allow their voices to weigh in. So I told my friends, I'm off to Calcutta. I want to measure happiness in the slums there. And my friend said, "Robert, you're crazy. You can save your trip. Forget it. You know they're not happy. Look at the conditions they live in. Thrown together ramshackle huts. They leak in the rain. They flood in the monsoon. The mosquitoes get in. They can get malaria. The tracks turn to mud. There are wild animals like pigs and roosters and chickens that go in and out of the houses, dogs. They track filth everywhere. The hygienic conditions are deplorable. These people sometimes don't have adequate nutrition. Their children are at risk for various developmental disorders, occasionally, in the most extreme cases, death. They don't have adequate employment. They don't have social mobility. My friend said, you can save your time. We know they're not happy. They don't even have Harry Potter. How could they be happy? But still, I wanted to go and talk to the people. I wanted to ask. So I went. And I showed up in the slums of Calcutta, and I was there on that trip for many months. And I showed up. I was excited to be there. I said, "Hi, I'm from North America. I'm from the United States, and I've come to measure your happiness." And their reaction was the same to me. "Oh, we're so sorry." I said, Sorry about what? Didn't you hear the part about USA? And they said, "That's what we're sorry about." I said, "What on earth? It's a glorious country. It's geographically diverse. It's beautiful. It's multicultural. We have a high standard of living. We have technological innovation, creativity. What are you talking about?" And they said, "Oh, but you don't know anything. You have that money. So much money, and all it does is separate you from one another. We noticed that on that great list you said you didn't seem to mention community. So we're sorry. We're sorry that you're from North America, where everyone must be so isolated and lonely. We should ask you about your happiness." And this was my first lesson. Opinions abound. Everywhere you go, it doesn't matter. The people in Calcutta have an opinion about your happiness, the happiness of the people in this room. And the people in this room have an opinion about their happiness. And this is why I love science. So I'm about to show you a slide. It's going to have data on it. That's numbers. For those of you who don't like such things, simply avert your eyes. If I would have known that Mathieu Richard was going to show 500 slides of data, I would have put more in here. I will only show you 3 slides of data and not in a row. I'll give you a little break between each. What I want to explain to you is what you're going to be looking at. I simply went and I asked them, how satisfied are you with your life on a 1 to 7 scale? And I wanted to ask on different domains of life. On a 1 to 7 scale, how satisfied are you with your food, with your income, with your housing, with your morality, with your physical appearance, with your intelligence, with yourself? 4 is the neutral point. So anytime you see a number above 4, that's good, that's positive. That means, yeah, I'm satisfied. And anytime you see a number below 4, it's dissatisfied. Let's take a look. I've separated, for your convenience, the different domains of life into the domains related to material aspects of life and the domains related to the self. And if you look at the Calcutta column, you can see something very striking. Yeah, these people have complaints about their material quality of life. If asked to make changes, if asked if they want something else, they would certainly say, yes, I am not satisfied with my material resources. My income, my housing, my health. I have complaints about all of them. So make no mistake, they're not just romantic heroes saying, oh, I just absolutely love living in squalor. They will be the first to complain about it. But the really interesting story comes at the bottom of the page, where we have all the self-related domains. This is a story about people who are not a little bit satisfied with themselves, but who are hugely satisfied with themselves. These people believe that they're good people. They believe that they're good looking. They believe that they're smart. They don't care that they live in poverty where their sense of self is concerned. It has not robbed them of their belief in themselves. And this is something that we can't just intuit when we're doing our armchair opinions, our armchair philosophy. This is something we have to use science, and this is where I think science is so great, that we get to go and find out this kind of deeper, more articulated picture of the happiness. So it's not just are they happy or aren't they happy, but rather where and how are they happy? Where do they enjoy successes, and where do they take a psychological hit? I went back in later years with a second sample and found the exact same finding. I replicated the study with a group of homeless people in Fresno, California. You can see it over on your right-hand side. The same pattern of results. People complain if they don't have material sufficiency, but that does not rob them of their sense of self. Even poverty is not strong enough to pull that away from us. I find that a hugely hopeful message. And I find it emblematic in some ways in this photograph I took of these three homeless men sleeping together on the roof. Make no mistake, you would not want to trade lives with these men. This is all they own. They fear police harassment. They are exposed to the elements. And yet they like themselves and they are together. And they told me they could count on one another. They trust one another. That's not always the story you get from everyone, so I think that's quite hopeful. But what about what the people in Calcutta had to say about the Americans? Was there any truth to their opinions? Are we just so lost? I'm going to show you two more pieces of data now. Then we'll be done with the data. The first is simply a survey of values taken of college students in the United States. One line measures how important the college students think developing a meaningful life philosophy is. The other line measures how important the college students think being financially well off is. And they measured this, college students, across years. And it is not a pretty picture. Perhaps there is some truth in what the people in Calcutta had to say. Perhaps there's some truth. It looks, if you can believe this survey, as if we are misplacing our traditional values, misplacing our ability to emphasize the importance of purpose in life and swapping it out with the pursuit of money and more superficial ends. It's interesting because you see the same kind of crossover pattern somewhere else in happiness research. And that is, when you ask people about their happiness, if they value money and if they value love. So I'm going to show you another picture. And this was college students. And we said, on a 1 to 7 scale, how important do you think love is? On a 1 to 7 scale, how important do you think money is? And then, depending on what they said about those two things, we mapped their happiness. Let's take a look. What you can see over here, these people are very happy. They're a 7 on a 7-point scale. They value love and devalue money. They had the most extreme valuation of love and the most extreme devaluation of money, and they were the happiest. The people who thought money was the most important and love was the least important were a 1 out of 7. They were absolutely the least happy. And then most of us think, somewhere in the middle, they're both a bit important. So most of us kind of end up above that neutral point, somewhere in this range, being mildly happy because we think, well, yeah, love is pretty good, and yeah, money is pretty good. So these are some of the most important lessons I've learned from my time with the people in Calcutta. And I think that those lessons are important. They're important in the way that public policy is important. But I don't know that they matter in the way that tucking your child in bed in the evening matters. That's the science. But somehow for me, it doesn't necessarily translate to the individual level. It lacks the humanity. So I want to sweep aside the curtain and tell you a personal story, sort of what happens behind the science. What you just saw was the stage show of the science. I showed you the cool picture. I showed you the data. But you didn't see how I got it and what I went through to get it. So remember when I told you that my job is traveling the world and studying happiness? It's an awesome thing to say to a stranger. My job is traveling the world and studying happiness. If I sit next to someone on the plane and I want to talk to them, I turn to them and I say, do you know that I travel the world and study happiness? And if I don't want to talk to them, I say, I'm a psychologist. Their earbuds go in, the book comes out, I have the next 8 hours free. What they didn't tell me in graduate school is that if your job is traveling the world and studying happiness, you have to talk about it 1,000,000 times with people. People say, how do you define happiness? What have you found? How can you measure happiness? And that's cool the first 20 or 30 times you have the conversation, but it gets really, really boring on about time 1,000. Which brings me to this very personal story that I want to share with you, and it starts in a bar in Calcutta. After collecting data for the day, I went for a pint with my research assistant, Andy. Now, Andy is kind of an intense-looking guy. I only mention that because that will come into the story in a moment. But Andy and I went and had a pint, and we had our stack of research data. Here's Andy, by the way. He's the one in the middle. And these people from England came in, and they sat down with us as travelers sometimes do, just hanging out in a foreign land, and we had a beer together. And this woman turned to me and she said, so, what do you do for a living? To this day, I have no idea why I said this. But I looked her straight in the eye, and I said, I am the Senior Vice President for Global Marketing at the Chicago-based Cult Corporation. You've probably heard of us. We're the leaders in marketable ideologies. She said, what are you talking about? I said, we manufacture cults for market. She was absolutely agog. She said, how could you possibly do this? And I said, well, it's just a matter of scale. There's 1 billion Indians. If each one gives a rupee, you figure it out. Plus, in our market testing, we found that India is cult central. They're really, really up for cults here. So what I've done, and I pulled out the data, I said what I've done is I've collected all of what they're satisfied and dissatisfied about, and we are going to tailor-make a cult that will fit this society. Her eyes were so wide, and I couldn't stop myself. I said, you know what we need? We need a cult leader. And we know through market tests with Gujarati communities back in Chicago that bald men make the best cult leaders. So I've got Andy here with me. And Andy has tested off the charts. Look at the smoldering look in his eyes. We think everyone will follow him. And this woman's reaction could only be summed up in one way. She looked at me and she said, "I think you are the most evil person I have ever met in my life." And it was at this very moment that I realized, I've taken it too far. This is what my wife is always telling me about. I should have listened. So I apologized to her. I said, I'm so sorry. Let me take a step back. I'm just a researcher. I work at a university. She said, "A university is funding this?" And I said, no, this is all fabricated. I'm lying to you. I was having a joke at your expense. It's an awful thing to do. I owe you an apology. And she took her hand like a gun, and she said, "If I had a gun, I would shoot you right now." And so I called for a taxi. And Andy and I left. 4 days later, I was in a very popular breakfast place in the tourist ghetto in Calcutta. And I was having breakfast by myself, and the door opens, and in walks this woman. And she looks terrible. She's sunburnt. Her hair's all frizzy and unwashed. She's practically staggering. She looks like she's lost weight. And just out of some impulse, call it compassion, I motioned to the seat in front of me. "Please, for the love of all that is holy, sit." And I ordered her breakfast. And it turns out that night, perhaps out of sheer rage, she had booked passage on a boat to the Andaman Islands, gotten on this boat, left. The boat had become disabled, and she had been adrift at sea for the last 4 days. The Indian Navy rescued her, brought her back, and she had just arrived in Calcutta, and I was the first person she was seeing. And I said to her, "I'm so glad to see you. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to buy you breakfast because I owe you an apology." And she said, "No, actually, I got that you were having me on. I owe you an apology." And I'm not going to pretend like we became best friends after that. I never saw her again after that day. But I can tell you we ate a very pleasant breakfast together. This is a woman who, mind you, would have shot me only days before. And here we are, eating breakfast together and giving one another a mutual apology. And I think this is what matters. The science I brought back from Calcutta is important. It can affect policy. It can affect group-level intervention. But this matters. Because whether we think that we found a particular route to happiness that's the way, whether it's mindfulness or altruism, empathy or compassion, I know that we will continue to make mistakes. I know that we will continue to make poor decisions. We will continue to be off-putting to other people. We'll say the wrong thing at the wrong moment. We'll pretend to be starting a cult. I know that no matter how hard we try, and I do believe our natures are good, we will collide with one another. But life is so beautiful in that it gives us so many second chances, that it gives us the opportunity to do over again and again, countless times. And that's something we haven't researched. Yeah, I made a mistake, but in the end, the aftermath was this great sense of connection, even though we started with hatred. And I think that's what really matters, the opportunity to do over and over and over until at last we get it right. Thank you.